law. Sounds like law school's in her future, and loves playing ultimate frisbee. Such fun to interview students. Because you get, when I have to introduce scholars and teachers, you never put CV. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and Abby. We're going to give us some highlights of all that they have found. And we are going to make this into, we already have in a way, a site that you all can access for information, for articles, for data studies and all that. And there's a lot of polling stuff on this, if you can handle it. And Cynthia Copeland, who's back here eating her lunch, as she should, is going to help maybe moderate this once we get going, when all you want to dive in. Cynthia is a public historian par excellence in New York City, has done exhibitions of all sorts around New York, including the one on Seneca Village in Central Park, Central Park. And she, last summer, and she teaches at NYU. Last summer, she was the director of our Public History Institute here at the GLC. So Cynthia may come up and help me moderate. But over to you, Abby.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Like Professor Light was saying, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Abby.
And we've been working with the GLC for about a month and a half doing research for this conference. We primarily were looking at news sources, but then also education mandates and just looking at general themes that have to do with this subject. And we're just going to share a few of our findings. So
amazing. So first, I want to talk a bit about what drew me to the issue and to this conference in general, which was my experience in the Philadelphia School District, which I think has like a pretty unique history of teaching this issue. Louder.
Yes.
Okay. So the Philadelphia
voice.
The Philadelphia School District has an African American history graduation requirement, which dates back to 2005 when it became the first city to have this type of requirement. And this looks like every student in the district taking African American history for a full year every day, their sophomore year of high school. And although the requirement was initiated in 2005, the push for it dates like much farther back. Like notably in 1967, there was a student walkout for Black history where students came to the school district building and protested and were brutalized by the police chief at that time. And that's a picture of the walkout. And again, student activism like 2 years ago got a marker for the walkout to kind of acknowledge the history of education in the city. But for me, I had a wonderful teacher for African Americans history, and she paired the course with a year-long project through National History Day. And for me, I was working on a documentary on the Selma marches, and I got to see, and I took the class in 2016, so I got to see kind of the impact of the stripping of the Voting Rights Act unfold while I was working on this historical project. And that's kind of when I really realized the impact of history and its bearing on the present, and the connection between social change in the past and in the present. So I think like teaching critical histories to like students and in their public schools is like so important, which is unfortunate because looking at kind of the state of legislation against CRT, like the picture is pretty bleak. This map shows kind of different levels of where states are with critical race theory legislation. The blue is states that a bill has been signed into law banning critical race theory. Red is a bill was proposed but vetoed, and then yellow is a bill has been proposed and is currently moving through the state legislature. And as you can see, there are only like 8 states where like banning critical race theory has not been on the legislative table, which is a very small amount considering. So how did we get here? So the critical race theory debate kind of began in 2020 during the pandemic when Christopher Rufo, who's like a conservative political activist, was coming across these anti-bias trainings that were being used in Seattle. And he was finding that the trainings would reference like anti-racism books, and then he looked at the books and found in the footnotes references to critical race theory and kind of latched onto this as something that was like radical and explicitly Marxist in his opinion, and started writing articles about this kind of danger. And he says that he thinks critical race theory is the perfect villain because woke and cancel culture were too vague and political correctness was like dated. So eventually he appeared on Fox News, and then the next day the Trump administration contacted him for help fighting the critical race theory issue. And then an executive order was passed, and that kind of started the momentum in the state legislatures. And although like Biden rescinded the executive order banning critical race theory trainings, kind of the momentum had already started with the state legislators, especially attacking this issue in education. So essentially conservative advocacy groups, legal organizations, and state legislatures are working together to weaponize teaching about race, and hoping that the fear it produces will help win elections. And it's an incredibly polarized issue. 70% of Democrats think that the study of history should question the past, while 84% of Republicans think the past should be celebrated. So then I just have a couple of anecdotes and examples of like what this looks like. So I think Florida is one of the states that's like very notable for this. The Department of Education told publishers to avoid critical race theory in textbooks. And this is an example of a math textbook that was rejected. It's kind of small. So it's like a bar graph about racial prejudice. So like that wasn't allowed. So, and their definition of critical race theory is the idea that racism is not merely the product of individual prejudice, but racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems. And then they also ban social justice lessons, which are anything seeking to eliminate underserved disadvantages for selected groups. Underserved disadvantages are mere chances of birth and are factors beyond anyone's control, thereby landing different groups in different conditions, and equality of treatment under the law is not a sufficient condition to achieve justice. So that's kind of the picture in Florida right now. And then in Oklahoma, teachers are very invested in this race for the State Board of Education, for Secretary of Education rather. And like there are real consequences on this legislation for schools. Like in Oklahoma, two public school accreditations were like demoted because of the curriculum. And then another example is in the Rockwood School District in Missouri. Teachers who are teaching diverse curriculums in schools have had to have like security details in their homes because of the backlash from the community. And even amongst like all of these kinds of pushbacks and like rolling back of diverse curriculums, there's also progress being made. Like this year, the College Board is piloting an AP African American Studies course for the first time, which will like eventually hopefully become part of the AP curriculum. So that kind of shows that there's like another side that wants to like move forward, even amongst like other people who are wanting to eliminate this from the curriculum. And then the last thing I really focused on in my research was looking at conservative perspectives. So that looks like reading sources from like far right newspaper articles and kind of seeing how and like what the tactics are to like create these arguments and explain them in kind of these more radical spaces. So so one article I read was arguing that critical race theory and teaching diverse histories in schools would ruin children's chances of becoming successful entrepreneurs because of the critique of individualism. And it also asserted that critical race theory rejects critical thinking, which seems kind of counterintuitive because they both have critical in the word. So I feel like that argument was a little hard to make, but it was saying that because it suggests that traditional modes of critical thinking might miss certain pieces of the problem, that means that it rejects all critical thinking instead of seeing that it's just a different type of critical thinking. And then another like anecdote from this dive into conservative sources is another big thing is like in terms of kind of how this impacts more like elementary age children is a lot of politicians are saying that social and emotional learning is kind of like a Trojan horse for critical race theory and are saying that that's also something that people should avoid. And for those who don't know, social and emotional learning is defined as advancing educational equity and excellence through authentic school, family, community partnerships to establish learning environments and experiences that feature trusting and collaborative relationships, rigorous and meaningful curriculum and instruction, and ongoing evaluation. SEL can help address various forms of inequity and empower young people and adults to co-create thriving schools and contribute to be safe and just communities. So basically it's like teaching kids like how they can interact with each other. And so the Washington Examiner says that due to the fact that social and emotional learning is helping students understand their identity in terms of intersectionality, that it's an example of critical race theory and should be avoided. And also argues that since self-management is part of social and emotional learning, which is like students' abilities to like manage their own emotions and manage their interactions with each other. Yeah, so that was also not good because it's part of like anti-racism is part of self-management, and therefore it's critical race theory. So it's kind of showing how like these like educational, like SEL has been like an educational like concept for a very long time. And it's showing that like the critical race theory debate is like bleeding into these like previously accepted concepts.
Okay. So similar to Abby, I was really drawn to this conference because of my experiences with education. So I grew up in Atlanta and I went to a Christian high school in the South. So you can probably imagine that there were just lots of voices within dialogue about education, especially in my last few years in high school. So in 2021, there were a lot of issues within my school regarding parental influence in what was being taught. So especially after the protests in the summer of 2020, there was really this movement within my school to shift some of the curriculum, especially in the history department. And there were parents who were very upset with this and were wanting to have more say in what was being taught. And so that kind of led to a lot of questions for me about who gets to decide curriculum, what is taught, and how should history be presented. I also spent a few years working at the Atlanta History Center. I specifically worked in Civil War memory. And as a docent, I was encountering a lot of people from the South who still kind of had this lost cause mythology mindset about the Civil War. This is really something that is passed through generations. And so again, I was thinking, you know, there's this historical pluralism that is so prevalent, especially in the South. And it just caused me to have a lot of big questions about learning and about the presentation of history. So my research was primarily about the curriculum wars, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And I was really looking at some of the key themes within this. So first of all, there are just many voices in conversations about education. So like I was saying, there's parents, there's teachers, legislators, and that can really put teacher autonomy in jeopardy. It also has resulted in this widespread distrust of teachers as professionals. And then of course, in recent years, there is especially a pushback on CRT, like Addie was talking about. And then also education is really becoming this political weapon and this political tool that is just really, I don't know, it's just really scary as a student to see that happening. And then finally, there's this idea of teaching breadth versus depth. And so there are these standardized programs that kind of, are shaping these curriculums to be very narrow, and it can restrict what a teacher teaches about history. So again, there is this highly decentralized system of designing curriculum and presenting history. And one of the recent things that's been happening is installing surveillance mechanisms in the classroom. So For example, there are cameras in some classrooms in Florida, Iowa, and Minnesota. There has been this removal of books from school libraries and banning of books, which is, of course, an issue that's been going on for a long time. And then there's even something in Indiana where taxpayers are allowed to spectate the classroom. So education and the classroom has really become this social space. And I think there's really a lot at stake with that. So a large part of what I was doing throughout this process was tracking what teachers have to say about this, which is really why you guys are here today. So a couple months ago, Professor Blight put out a tweet asking teachers about some of their thrills and challenges of teaching history today. And we're seeing these themes coming up over and over again. So I have highlighted 3 really notable tweets here. And all 3 of them really are focusing on just how high stakes it is to teach history and how it's become this extremely controversial subject. There are many people in this country who want to maintain this cauterized and sanitized narrative of history that very much preserves this culture of white supremacy. But then there are a lot of thrills in teaching history because you have this responsibility of teaching these students who can potentially go change how things are today. So
Go ahead and read one of them.
okay, I'll read one. All right, so this
Your
first,
favorite one. You sent me dozens.
yes, I did. I found this middle tweet to be very notable. So the account says that history is stripped down via political forces unrelated to good historiographical or pedagogical practices to a sanitized, cauterized I narrative that definitionally silences voices in stories deemed inconvenient to the loudest, most caustic anti-historical elements. So I think that really summarizes a lot of the findings that we had in our research. So now we want to turn it over to you all. We'd love to hear about your experiences with these issues and
You're the experts right now, so.
yes.
Did you have any teachers respond to the post kind of upholding or like sticking to like parents' rights and whatnot? Like anyone pushing back on this?
That's a great question. I found that overwhelmingly, and maybe this is also just the crowd that is following Professor Blight on Twitter. I would say that I was seeing much more of this, but there was a lot of people vocalizing how difficult it is to have, this parent influence and state legislator and just all these mandates and conflicting instructions about how to teach. But we did see a lot of those perspectives in research and articles that we're reading. Thank you.
When I would put out the trust the teachers business, there were some who wrote in and said, "Are you kidding? I had a teacher I never trusted."
Just a question, do you know in how many states the Secretary of Education or the head of education is an elected position?
I do not know. That is a very good question, though.
Everybody hear that?
Yeah.
If anyone does know.
No, I mean, it would be huge if in
Yeah.
the states where that's an elected thing.
Yeah,
I know it is for sure in Oklahoma. And
State
that's kind
boards too, are they all?
of the center of that, yeah.
No? Not in Florida.
yes.
So are you guys both history majors? My first question, and if so, what teachers were formative in your life in high school and led you to consider becoming a history major?
Great question.
I love this question. Yeah, so I kind of mentioned earlier this, but I had this teacher in high school, Mrs. Taylor, for 2 years, one year African American studies, and then in senior year for civics and government. And she was just like such a good teacher. Like I mentioned that like the year-long project, like really getting to delve into like a topic in like high school, like was something that wasn't really like often an option in like the Philly public schools, but also just like she would incorporate like we had a textbook, but we like barely used it. There were like she'd set up primary sources all around the room and we'd like walk around and like analyze them and have like a little worksheet to fill out, or like same with like our homework readings would often like center around articles and primary sources rather than the textbook. It was just kind of like an anchoring point that we maybe come back to. So I think that really was why I became a history major.
I've always kind of had an interest in narratives and storytelling. And so I think that's really at the foundation of my love for history. I would say my most formative history teacher was my senior year history teacher in high school. And he, first of all, he was just very passionate about it, and that makes a really big difference as a student. And he really used primary sources and encouraged students to come to their own conclusions rather than having us read a textbook every night, which is something I had done in previous history classes that can have very specific narratives of history. And he also really helped me to start to see history as not just the past, but how the past informs the present. And so I was starting to kind of shift how I was looking at my life today and my surroundings, such that I could see what led to that and what caused that. And I think that's something that really shaped my passion for history and my path as a history major.
Thank you.
Yeah, how has this project made you guys more or less likely enthusiastic about actually going into a classroom and being a teacher?
Before law school.
Oh, that you surrendered all hope if you go to law school.
I think it's complicated because I think like
You can be a great historian.
at the same time,
Complicated.
at the same time, like it both motivates me more because like I like really feel like I have strong opinions about how history should be taught and like what could really change this country in terms of like through a classroom and like by empowering students with like the knowledge that everything isn't perfect and wasn't always perfect. But then at the same time, like there is that fear that like I wouldn't be able, like I would be like very restricted in terms of what I was teaching. I do think most realistically I'd go back to Philly to teach, so I think it would be probably less of an issue there. But there is the dynamic of it being like a very blue city and a swing state, so that could also come into play.
Yeah, I feel the same way where I know that going into that space, you would be, there are a lot of forces and pressures on you as a teacher. But if anything, I feel like I feel more motivated after this project because teaching is just such an important and informative and formative profession, and the impact that you can have on students at a really in-depth level is really amazing. And like we were saying earlier, you can have teachers who completely shape your path as a student and otherwise. And I think that's something that I find to be very inspiring.
Got a lot of teachers here who want to give you a hug.
Dr. Allen
Or maybe you're
mentioned,
talking to one of them.
yeah. Dr. Allen mentioned this morning that that she's seen like a lot of the youth being like disaffected in general by like the polarity and not seeing government change the way that it needs to. Like in your roundabouts on campus, people who are not history majors, do they like echo that same kind of disaffected interest in participating in voting and all that comes with it?
I think for me, it has really varied based on where I've been learning and what educational spaces I've been a part of. I think Yale in general is a place where you can walk around campus and no matter what people are studying, you have people who are really passionate about what they're doing and committed to doing something good. I think that's pretty unique to my experience at Yale. But I have been, like, I mean, in my experience going to high school in the South, I did find it to be very, like, it can be really difficult to be in an environment where you are seeing these extremely radical sides of the spectrum. And it can feel difficult to make progress in that sort of setting, I would say.
Yeah, I definitely think it depends on what area of campus you're like a part of. I think like as a senior, I've like found my people, and those people all care about these things. And I think that's something that I really prioritize is the people I interact with. But I definitely feel like in more random groups, like I remember coming here freshman year and having like a suite of random people, and like none of them were registered to vote, even though we were all over 18. And I was like, guys, you have to register to vote. And like, I helped them register to vote, but we're no longer friends, and I don't know if they're still voting. The back.
Hi, I teach here in Connecticut a Black and Latino Studies class, and it's a school that I teach at. It's a requirement for students to graduate. And all of the students who I teach are Black and Latino, but it's now a requirement this year in Connecticut that all schools offer it as an elective. I'm looking at you as, a white student who, was required to take it in Philadelphia. And do you think that that helped to be a formative experience for other white students? Because my concern as a teacher is that my own children may not be exposed because my school system won't offer it as, a requirement for students to take. So do you think as a white student, it was something that helped to inform you as a historian?
Yeah, I think it was a really important class to take as a white student. I mean, Philly is like a very Black school district, and I think it's like a very valuable thing for those students too. And I will say that like attention in the Philly school district is that a lot of the teachers are white. So a lot of the teachers teaching the history are white to often like very Black classrooms. But I think that for me, I had like gone through very like structured and like very like, like kind of like almost feeling like propaganda style history classes like in middle school that like, taught about like the colonies and everything in like a very like a way that didn't really resonate because I think it didn't really feel real. And I didn't like have kind of the critical thinking or like the historical backing to really like acknowledge and recognize that, but like looking back. So I think that like it's really important for like white students to know what is like actually happened and like what I think that it should be a requirement for everyone because I think that's how we create people who like have empathy. And like one of the panelists was talking about like the collective versus the individualism in the last event. And I think like that is really important in terms of like creating a public that will work towards a collective good instead of like everyone's individual good. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I was, okay. Former high school teacher, inspiration, my own teacher was Richard Merckx, my sixth grade history teacher, who read us these stories of horrible disasters from the past. We were all boys school when we were 12. But what he brought back to us was that history is about humans, it's about actual human beings, not just things you memorize to give tests. I'm curious in your work if you came across anything about like the social, what these different bodies think that the societal goal of history education should be. Because to quote a big Yale professor, Henry Jones or Indiana Jones, archaeology or history is the study of fact, philosophy is the study of truth. So it seems to me that if you want people to know the truth, that's maybe not for history. So I'm just curious kind of what the social goals you found on different sides, what people want history to do. I've been a teacher myself. I know and take comfort to an extent that 9 out of 10 of my students are not going to become historians. If they did, I'd have a lot of competition in the job market. So, what those students,
Which you already do. I mean,
absolutely, yeah. But what the goals for those students who take history, hopefully do well, are interested, but are going to then go out and be any other job and any other kind of lifestyle.
I think that's a great question and a very interesting distinction to make between philosophy and history. I feel like I think that in my view, history is so subjective to the person who's experiencing each moment. And I think there's a danger in seeing history as a singular fact or set of knowledge, because that can proliferate single narrative histories. And I would say that in terms of history education and what the purpose is, I think it goes to a broader conversation about what the purpose of education is as a whole. And maybe that's part of the issue, that there are these extremely conflicting ideas about what education should achieve, whether it's to support democracy or create citizens or prepare people for future careers, or to teach people to think critically and make changes and address problems that they're facing and they're surrounded by and they're observing. And yeah, what do you think, Abby?
Yeah, no, for like going back to the sources, I think it was kind of like a spectrum, right? Where like in the most conservative sources, like they talked about creating entrepreneurs as like the ideal of like history or like the education system, versus like I would say like the more farther on the left is like creating change makers or people who are going to go out and like make their mark on society. And then like I feel like creating citizens is often something that can be used in a lot of different ways, like because that's just kind of such a vague idea, like, right, like what is a citizen, like how do we define a citizen? I think like that could look like upholding the systems in place, or it could look like changing the systems. But I think those are kind of like three like main goals that I saw in like people's view of what history, like what teaching history should do.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Let's take one more and then we kind of resume again downstairs. Go ahead.
I don't know if this is, I'm trying to think about this question because I was thinking about it with the last panel, but it seems like the forces on the right have been able to kind of think about words, buzzwords that really resonate, like critical and, you know, I'm thinking of Goals 2000, like 20 years ago, that was a big debate. Even social studies back in the 30s. I mean, was it your impression investigating the landmine of social media that the left hasn't been able to do that as effectively in terms of thinking of words that really, does it make sense what I'm asking? It's sort of like a marketing. I wonder how much of this is marketing. I think critical race theory makes people think of Marxism and, you know, there's still this like.
And is evocative.
Yeah.
Immediately, like evokes it. Yes.
So kind of.
Right, so is there any equivalent on the, I don't see it, but is there any equivalent on the other side?
No, I think that's a really good perception of the issue. And I think honestly, I think it's like very reflective of the political system, like more broadly, like beyond this issue. I think that the problem is that the left doesn't really have like one idea of what education should be. Like, I feel like there's like a much larger range of like opinions and beliefs versus like a much more narrow kind of, and I feel like that's by design because it's not really the critical race theory education debate. I feel like for the conservatives isn't actually about education in the same way that kind of creating this like deciding curriculum is maybe on the left, and is more about stoking fear and, you know, keeping power and maintaining power, whether that be like electoral power or like systems of white supremacy. So I think that is kind of like a gap, is that there isn't something to rally around.
Maybe build on that for a second. Like, I just see the right is always saying no.
What's that?
They just always say no.
And it's simple,
Right, so that you don't
Yeah, right.
need like, you don't need complex ideas, whereas I feel like the left actually tries to figure out how to like do something. And the right's just like, no. And it was
It's like
like,
giving
no, because of
ideas
critical
and
race
more
theory, or
words,
no,
right?
because of like
Yeah.
whatever.
These are the good faith actors.
So it doesn't
Right.
matter, like you don't need to put as much work into it, you're just saying no. Like, you're not gonna take my
Very
guns.
strong
you're
and
not gonna take
emphatic
my-
no, right?
Like, whatever.
Could I,
So I'm afraid we're gonna have to start wrapping up.
Just one more.
could I ask a
Thank you
simple?
very much.
Did any of the people that responded to this agree with the criticism?